Hi, everyone. This is a brief account of a paper I published a few years ago called Why There Is No Evidence for the Intrinsic Value of Non-Human Nature. It was published in the journal Ethics and the Environment back in 2011. Link below to a freely available version of the paper on Phil Papers. So if you're interested, you can read it there, take a look at the abstract. And I just very quickly wanted to reconstruct the general argument of that paper, but first set up what the issue is regarding intrinsic value. So it's a very common move historically in environmental philosophy, so in environmental ethics in particular, to make the claim that the non-human world, the natural world, independent of human interests, has some kind of value of its own, often in a moral sense, that it's good for its own sake, and not merely for the ways in which human beings might make use of it. So everyone admits that nature or some aspects of non-human nature can have instrumental value for human beings. So, for example, we can extract resources, we can rely on it, land for growing food, and things like that. But many environmentalists want to go further and say nature is also good for its own sake, and that gives us a reason to, for example, preserve it and not to exploit it. Because if something is good for its own sake, simply in and of itself, then it presumably would be wrong, without good reason at least, to cause harm to it, to damage it. So you might make a similar analogous point to a work of art. So something that we hold in high esteem, say the Mona Lisa or something, that's valuable not simply because of the money you could get by selling it if you owned it. It's good for its own sake, right? There's something valuable about what it is. It's simply a great work, and that's what art is supposed to be. So maybe something similar is going on with the natural world. So that sounds reasonable enough, but you run into some problems with that. So the first question, or at least some challenges. So the first question is, what do we mean by intrinsic value? And this in and of itself is quite a big issue. There are many senses of the term intrinsic value that are used, but one influential conception is the idea that intrinsic value is some kind of property that's independent of our minds. So on this view, associated with philosophers like G.E. Moore, and then taken up by environmental philosophers like Holmes Rolston III and a number of others, on this idea of intrinsic value, there exists outside of our mind, so outside of human cognition and perception, a property that is that simply belongs to some objects. So some objects have this property called intrinsic value. It's a real property. It's something that's out there independently of what anyone happens to think, in the same way as you might think properties of density or mass or something like that would be properties that objects have independently of our knowing it or our perceiving it. So objects in the universe that we've never observed or don't even know the existence of would still have a mass, for example. So maybe intrinsic value is like that. And this is a pretty strong version of intrinsic value, a pretty strong conception, by which I mean, if it exists, it's a purely objective property. It's not something that we make up. It's not something that we can simply deny the existence of. Well, we can, but if we do, we'd be wrong. So this is attractive to people who want to make the argument that there's something in the natural world outside of human interests that is just objectively good. It's not simply that we happen to like it. It's not simply that some groups have an interest in preserving it, but it's that these objects, these natural objects, whatever they are, whether they're organisms or ecosystems or something else, the claim would be that these things are just inherently, intrinsically good, and they are so in virtue of this property called intrinsic value. that these objects possess. So this is a view that is still defended by some people. So although there are other conceptions of intrinsic value that are out there that my argument does not address, this conception of intrinsic value has been very important in environmental philosophy, especially in some of the most important early work by some of the founding figures in the field. So I mentioned Rolston earlier. So now we can get to the argument that I defend in the paper. So the reason, set of reasons as to why I think that we could never have evidence for the existence of such a property, which of course creates problems for the view that nature has intrinsic value in this strong sense. Because if we couldn't have any evidence for that under any circumstances, then it seems that we could never be justified in holding the view that nature in fact has intrinsic value of that kind. So what's the argument? How does it work? Imagine two different worlds, call them A and B, two different natural worlds, possible worlds that we can conceive of. And in terms of the observable properties, everything that, let's say, a human being could perceive in those worlds is identical, so exactly the same. So that's in terms of the species that exist, the vegetation, the planets that happen to be there, the exact placement and interactions of every single object in these worlds would be identical in empirical terms, in terms of anything that we could observe. So everything, sky's the same color, atmosphere is the same composition, all the same animals exist, all that stuff. But in one world, let's say world A, some of those natural objects have this property called intrinsic value. This feature that doesn't depend upon human judgment, observation, or perception, but is just there. And then suppose in world B, which again, in terms of what we can observe, is identical to world A, in world B, nothing has that property of intrinsic value. So these are two perfectly conceivable worlds that we can imagine, identical in terms of everything that we can see and study, but different in that one of the worlds has intrinsic value and the other doesn't. And this makes sense because on the conception of intrinsic value we're discussing, it's considered to be a property, right? Its own distinct, discrete property. And if that's the case, well, logically, I can imagine a world that has that property, and then I can imagine a world that doesn't have that property. So it doesn't seem like there's any trickery going on here in terms of what we can conceive. The world with intrinsic value seems possible. The one without it also seems possible. Now the question arises, what about the actual world? Does the actual world have this property or not? Well, according to my argument, we could never know. We could never possibly have any evidence that it does have intrinsic value, simply because everything that we can observe, everything that we can study, anything that we can perceive would be identical, regardless of whether or not this property of intrinsic value is present. And to back up that claim, the reason why I think the two worlds would have to be identical and we have no way of inferring the existence of intrinsic value is that under no account that I'm aware of does anyone think that, well, with an exception I'll come back to in a second, under normal conditions, it doesn't seem possible that we could directly perceive such a property. This conception of intrinsic value as a discrete property, if you look around, it doesn't seem like we see it, right? I can observe other properties, colors, mass, things like that. You can run through your own experience or through running scientific experiments. We can observe more or less directly various properties in the empirical world. But intrinsic value is, under this conception, almost always thought of as being a non-empirical property, as something that you can't directly observe. Unlike, say, the properties, something has the property of mass, the mass of some object. You can't directly see intrinsic value. Instead, it's often the case that intrinsic value is inferred from the presence of some other properties. So what that is will vary depending upon the theory, but you might say that, well, something that's integrated in a certain way, say it composes a harmonious whole, we'll say from that we can infer, just imagine that's your account, from that we can infer that that object that has these observable properties also has intrinsic value, which is a non-observable property. But now you can see why that would be a problem based on our thought experiment earlier. Imagine those two worlds, A and B, one with the property of intrinsic value and one without it. Those worlds are identical in terms of what we can observe, what we can study and experience. So that being the case, we have no way of knowing if we're in the world in which objects that form integrated harmonious wholes have intrinsic value, or if we're in the world in which objects that are integrated and harmonious lack intrinsic value. The seemingly only way around this problem is to say that we have some sort of faculty whereby we can directly perceive non-empirical properties. So you might want to make the argument that, well, you can't see or taste intrinsic value, but nonetheless we can perceive it because we have this special faculty somehow built into our cognition, or maybe some non-cognitive capacity that allows us to access the presence of intrinsic value and directly observe whether or not it's there. But that's not very attractive because it doesn't seem like we have such a faculty. I mentioned before that there wasn't an exception to a certain claim. So the philosopher G.E. Moore did argue that we have a kind of intuition that's capable of directly perceiving properties like intrinsic value. But that's not a very widely held view today. It's hard to see how that's true. It sure doesn't seem like we have that faculty, and you won't find many defenders of it. So I won't say much more about that, but if someone wants to present an argument that they do have that kind of faculty and we can use that to observe non-empirical properties, then that would be interesting to hear about. But I'm not really aware of a plausible argument that would defend that, and that might explain why so few environmental philosophers would appeal to that nowadays. So without such a special faculty of intuition or perception or some means of directly observing the non-empirical properties of objects, it seems that we're stuck with inferring value from the presence of empirical properties. But that throws us back to the original problem. How do we know that we're in world A or world B? In terms of all the evidence that we can gather, in terms of everything that we can see and study, the two worlds would be identical. So it's hard to see how I would ever have sufficient grounds for making the claim that I'm justified in asserting that this object over here has the non-empirical property intrinsic value. Yes, you can't see it, you can't directly observe it, but trust me, it's there. How could I ever know that? And if I can't know that, for the reasons we've discussed so far, then that seems to indicate that we could never have that we could never have evidence for the existence of intrinsic value in the sense that we've been discussing, right? So in the sense of a discrete, mind-independent property that's just out there in the world. Now, of course, if this argument works, it does not imply anything about other conceptions of intrinsic value that have been defended. So you might think of intrinsic value as some kind of natural property, and defend that kind of view. Or you might think of intrinsic value as not a mind-independent property, but rather as something that we humans or valuers confer upon natural objects. And you could even make an argument that it's still objective in some sense, depending on how that conferral actually works. So I'm not saying anything about those other conceptions. This is purely about the classic idea of mind-independent properties. Okay, so I hope that argument's interesting. Like I said, have a link below to that paper if you want to take a read, and I'll talk to you next time.